Welcome to the Smart Business Revolution.
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 You want a revolution?
You say you want a revolution?
Revolution. The revolution.
It's going on right now.
Welcome to The Revolution, the Smart Business Revolution podcast, where we ask today's most successful entrepreneurs to share the tools and strategies they use to build relationships and connections to grow their revenue. Now, your host for The Revolution, John Corcoran.
All right, welcome everyone. John Corcoran here, the host of Smart Business Revolution podcast, and I get to talk every week with amazing CEOs, founders, entrepreneurs, coaches, executives of companies and organizations like YPO, EO, Activation, Blizzard, Vistage, LendingTree, OpenTable, Act Software, many more. I'm also the co-founder of Rise25, and we help connect B2B business owners to their ideal prospects. And I'm excited today because my guest is Tonya Twitchell, and Tonya is a speaker, coach, consultant, and she's a chair for Vistage Worldwide, which we'll talk about in a moment if you haven't heard of Vistage. And she works with high-performing CEOs, business owners, and senior executives who are working on engaging with and leveraging their best selves and their teams as well. And she is a former senior executive for two rapidly growing companies and has helped many different companies to increase revenue and profitability, and has led, trained, and coached a variety of different leaders in different industries and sectors, including everyone from healthcare, finance, government, public sector, even the United States Air Force. So we're going to jump into that in a moment. But first, before we get into that, this episode is brought to you by Rise25 Media. And at Rise25, we help B2B businesses to get clients, referrals, and strategic partnerships with done-for-you podcasts and content marketing. And you are listening to this right now, so you've probably heard of podcasts before. It's an emerging medium, and it's doing tremendously well, picking up, getting more attention. And if you've ever thought about doing a podcast, we say yes. It's one of the best things I've ever done in my life, helped to connect to an amazing array of interesting people. And so if you are interested and you have a B2B business with high client lifetime value, it's going to be great for you. So give me a call or send us an email at support@rise25media.com or check us out on the web at rise25media.com. All right. So Tonya, I'm excited to talk to you. You were kind enough to have me as a guest speaker at one of your Vistage meetings a couple of weeks ago, or a week or two ago. And that was a pleasure. You had a great group of executives and CEOs. And first of all, let's talk about, you had a rough ride a couple years ago. So you lost a number of family members, something we all have to deal with sooner or later in our lives, but a lot in a short period of time. And in addition to it being incredibly challenging, it led to a major reboot in your career, and you made some big decisions. So take us back to that period of your life and what that was like, and how you ended up changing your life because of it.
Absolutely. So thank you, John, for having me here with you. 2013 through 2017 were rough. In 2013, in the space of 9 months, I lost my dad, my grandmother, my brother. And then fast forward to 2017, I got a call that my mom was killed instantly in a car accident. And a couple of months later, my stepfather passed away.
Wow.
You don't go through a period like that, at least I don't believe you do, without really taking a look at who am I, how am I playing, and what the heck am I getting up for each and every day in my life. And, each of those 5 scenarios was really different. The 2 that were the most dramatically different were losing my brother and losing my mom.
Wow.
With my brother, I had to really take a look at how I had showed up with him in particular, and how I was being as a person in my relationships. And that was a really important pivot point for me. That was the point when I said, I'm changing the game that I'm playing, and I'm going to focus on different targets. I'm going to think in terms of different KPIs. I'm going to rethink these goals and tie them to something bigger. And it made all the difference. It made all the difference in terms of the peace and the ability to move forward. When 4 years later, I was right back in one of those moments again.
And what was it like the second time going through it? Had you were you more prepared the second time around because you had asked those hard questions?
I don't know that you're ever prepared to get a phone call that says the world as you knew it has just been flipped on its head. Although there was certainly a different and more immediate peace in the sense that I didn't have regret. And I didn't immediately have this big hammer that I pulled out to beat myself up over the last conversation, or I wish I would have said, or I wish I would have done. When my brother actually committed suicide in 2013, and when I got the call that he had taken his life, the first thing I thought of was the last time I saw him and this ridiculous argument that we had over sandwiches. Like this nothing of a nothing of a nothing. And the piece that was so hard for me to put down, it wasn't that we had this argument. It was that I didn't clean it up. I didn't come back to it and say, you know what, my part in that moment, I was judgmental. I was taking out some frustration on you because you happened to be there. You were trying to talk to me. I wasn't listening. I fundamentally didn't care enough and didn't champion you enough to even see that you were with me in the room. And interestingly enough, my mom and I had a conversation. She had a similar level of regret in terms of how some things were left with my brother. And she and I got real clear that no matter what happened as we went forward, she and I were going to play it differently with each other. We actually made an agreement that if one of us had a moment where we had a conversation or something that felt unfinished, that we were going to hold ourselves to the standard of coming back and addressing, hey, my part, or I have awareness that I may not have shown up as my best self. I might not be ready to clean it up yet, but I'm at least going to raise the flag and acknowledge and own that that is part of how I played. Our agreement was that we would do that within 24 hours. And for the next 3.5 years, that's what we did. And so in the moment that I got the call and I learned that my mom had left this planet, it didn't take away the pain. My mom was my person. She was my best friend. And it didn't make that part easier. However, I knew with certainty that she and I were clean. I knew what she thought and felt about me, and I knew that there was no question for her on her side, that there wasn't anything else that I was ever going to wish or have a moment of, if only I had said. And so that's a big part of how I challenge myself, how I challenge others. That's a big part of where and how I lead from and how I engage with anyone that I'm working with. Because that's what we ought to be playing for.
What's really interesting about your story, is that you're someone who had been in a coaching capacity. You'd done work on yourself, I imagine, personal development. So you're not someone who'd ignored elements of your personality and then had it all come crashing to the forefront when you suffered these tragedies. So just reflect on that for me a little bit, what that was like, in that, on the one hand, you'd worked as a coach, you knew probably many of these things, but they're so difficult in life to, walk the walk of what we know, what we learned, what we trained, that for you, it was a struggle. And it was something that, it took this tragedy for these changes to be implemented in your life.
Yeah, so they're one of my all-time most devoted champions and mentors used a phrase, almost 2 decades ago, where she would say, and has said over and over again, casualness breeds casualties. And sometimes the fact that we know and we're so in the groove of teaching or training or coaching other people, we can become casual or think that we've got it covered, we can check it off the list, we don't have to be vigilant or alert or watch for moments where our blinders may be on, or we may start slipping into a habit that just isn't in alignment isn't in alignment with what we want or who we want to be going forward.
Hmm.
And so as I have taken stock on that period in my life, I was really good at championing a lot of people in a lot of places. I just was inconsistent.
Hmm.
Right? And part of what I believe contributed to me being inconsistent is I didn't hold myself to some of the same standards that I would have and was coaching all of my clients around, in terms of how are you evaluating, where are you reviewing, what's your checkpoint, what's your checklist, where and when are you pausing to take inventory. Where I was really good at taking inventory was on the tasks and the do's and the process. However, I wasn't consistent in that point at taking inventory on the B's, on how I was showing up and thinking about the ripples that I may not have been consciously aware of in that moment, yet I might have seen a day or a week or a month later if I had paused and allowed myself to simply reflect.
Hmm. Yeah, what we're talking about here is it strikes me that it's kind of the lines are blurred between how we show up personally, how we show up professionally, right? They're all interrelated. If our personal life is going to pieces, then it's going to affect our professional life. It's going to affect our career or our business. How do you work with clients where, given what you've been through, maybe you see a client who is not living a life in alignment, as you put it, and you want to broach that with them. You want to help them to avoid the mistakes that you did, but that's such a challenge to get someone to realize that for themselves without them being defensive. So how do you work with clients when you want to get them to enact a change of that sort?
Yeah, so what I've settled into after a couple of decades of doing this is the client has to be ready. And the less that I have judgment or expectation or attachment to how far or how fast a particular individual moves or steps, the more I can meet them where they are and be curious with them and hold space and possibility, so that I'm inviting and encouraging them versus you have to do it because I say so or because I somehow know something that you don't.
Hmm.
Right? None of us like to be told what to do.
Right.
None of us like more things added to our list. And so
Right.
a lot of how I work with clients, particularly if they're not comfortable yet or not as familiar or practiced at seeing their leadership across their lives versus in one area or one domain or one moment, is to simply do some translation, to gently observe, to ask questions, to invite them to consider where or how they might start taking something that they want to get better at or nuance differently in one area, and allow themselves to also practice that differently in other areas of their life. So as an example, whenever I have a corporate client who is challenged with or has identified something that they want to improve in their communication, one of the things that we often will talk about and that I'll encourage them to consider is the ability to practice how they want to be as a communicator in the other spaces and times of their lives that are outside the walls of that company or outside the walls of their traditional workday. There's, I think it was The Power of Habit, or there are a couple of great books that talk about, the 20,000 hours or whatever that number was of the,
Right.
essentially the more you practice, the better you get. And until you practice a lot, if we are unrealistic in our expectations to think that we're going to become a rock star at it overnight.
So just to give like an example of this is what you're talking about. Like if you're having trouble being honest with your executive team or with your employees or with your boss or whatever, then, when you're at church, being honest with someone at church or being honest with your family members or kind of practicing it in that way. Is that what you're talking about?
Yes. So I like to think about how whatever I'm wanting to improve on as a leader, how and where can I practice it And I love low stakes practice because I think of it as a muscle. The more I practice, the stronger that muscle gets. And the stronger that muscle is in wherever it is in my life that I'm practicing, the better prepared I'll be when the stakes are higher.
Got it.
Right?
So yeah,
So the example.
I know someone who gives a great example of like a way to get outside of your comfort zone is just when you're ordering a coffee at a coffee shop, ask for 10% off. Not for any particular reason, just because, it's facing the fear of potentially facing rejection.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's getting outside of ourselves. And one of the ways that I equate it often is we all have these stories or these perceptions of who we are and what we can do. And often those stories are based off of the evidence that we're accustomed to seeing and carrying. So sometimes the fastest way for us to realize I'm actually better at that thing that I'm giving myself credit for is to simply focus on gathering different evidence so that we have a more balanced, complete view, right? I'm probably really good at speaking up in certain areas of my life and just less good at speaking up in certain specific types of scenarios. So rather than focusing on the place where it feels hard and having additional anxiety and things that I have to overcome, let me just get really good at remembering I'm already good and in momentum and have energy and evidence that I can do it. And then think about how do I bridge that or just nuance or adjust it so that it feels more authentically, comfortably me in this place where I haven't quite found my stride.
Right. And do you find that people are able to bridge that gap, or is it sometimes too far of a gap for them to come, or is it just simply a matter of time?
Sometimes it's a simple thing of a matter of time. Sometimes it's as simple as allowing yourself to look at it differently.
Looking at differently, like seeing, like you said, like realizing that you can do it in this part of your life, you just are struggle to do it in this other part of your life.
Yeah, we are all incomplete storytellers.
Hmm.
And just from a neuroscience, there's only so much information that can get in and that we can grab onto and pay attention to in any particular time. So some of this is like tuning our antenna. What am I allowing myself to focus on? And what are the things that I default to notice first? How can I invite and allow myself to start noticing other things too?
Mm-hmm.
So, sometimes we get in our own way because we're trying to push things away. Well, pushing things away is a whole lot harder than just opening the door a little bit wider to allow one more thing to walk in with the things that we already expect or accustomed to seeing in the mix.
Mm-hmm.
I am all about efficiency and all about how do I move forward and leapfrog and move fast for the minimum amount of work and effort. So the places that I love to tinker and that I get most excited about with my clients are when we can just make subtle shifts, things that are very easy for them to say, yeah, I could do that, and then get into action. And then once we're in action, it becomes easier to go, oh, okay, I can do that too, or I can do something a little bigger, or that thing that wasn't as hard or as challenging as I thought. So maybe I'll say yes to this other thing that, previously back in time or 2 days ago, a month ago, a year ago, I never would have even given myself the opportunity to think about because it was so big and scary in relation to where I am now.
I'm curious, we were talking beforehand. You said I think you said you're a natural born coach, or you feel natural. That's who you are. And looking at your career trajectory, you worked for this PSI seminars, early on in your career. And so you were doing coaching, but is this something you realized at a young age? Like, were you like 7 years old and you're like coaching other kids on the schoolyard? Like, when did you realize like I'm a coach?
Yeah, so I've always been rolling up my sleeves, and depending on which relative you would ask, some of them would say that I like to be the lead, or like to be the spotlight, or want the attention, or just think I know the answer. In some way, shape, or form, I have always found my way to it. Where I would say I really started to settle into and discover and have awareness around okay, that there might be something to this, and this might be something that I really ought to pursue, was when I was in high school. I was in high school in the 90s. HIV/AIDS education was sort of this new thing that wasn't really being done well uh, in the state where I happened to be going to school at the time. And I am fortunate that I have a number of educators who are across different levels of education in Southern California. And I got it in my head that I could go and be the one to help bring education to my fellow students. And with their support and in partnering with some local associations and organizations in our community, I got myself trained up. I actually became the first ever HIV/AIDS certified instructor through the American Red Cross back at that time. Fast forward a year or so later, and I was actually received a paycheck from the California State Department of Education for some like consulting training, this project that I did with some other teens around this area. And so it was kind of in that lane that I discovered I have a voice. And when I ask questions and I raise my hand and I help other people to ask questions, that we are able to move things forward. And so I would say for me, that was where it all began. And then as I got into college, I thought I'd go left, and then I thought I'd go right, and then I thought I'd, do this or that. And the first couple of jobs I had right out of college didn't matter what the title or position was. Within about 90 days, I was training and educating and coaching and doing things in that space because someone other than just me thought that would be a fit and opened up the door. So, 20-ish years ago now, I finally said, I guess I'll just settle into this can be my real gig. I don't need something else with this as the side thing, and haven't looked back since.
I'm curious, I have an 18-month-old daughter and 3 boys before that. So I had 7 years of boys and boy testosterone before our daughter came along. And you mentioned when you were a kid, kind of the way that people reacted. And I want to explore that a little bit further because I feel like with the Me Too movement, there's been more awareness of the way that girls are treated in this society. And do you think, or did you experience that you were treated any differently? Because, in some families, a budding daughter might be treated differently, or it might be looked down upon or characterized in a more negative light versus the way that a budding coach, 7-year-old coach boy would be. Did you experience that at all?
I did at certain moments. Although right alongside those moments, I had some amazing champions in my life. My mom and my aunt were they're two of the bravest women I've ever met. They worked their way up through corporate America. They were some of the women among seas of men and trying to figure it out and figure out how do we balance it and do this, and can we have families and careers. And so I was very lucky that the majority of the influence that I was around day to day came from people whose basic attitude and approach was, if you want to do it, let's figure it out. That more than anything shaped my story of me, and that makes it easier when I start to get in my own way and start to doubt, can I do this? Am I good enough? Do I have what it takes? Why me versus somebody else? I hear their voices in my head. And so that's, I'm in the process of working on a book right now, and I've been thinking really specifically around who am I going to champion, and who are the right readers for this book? And yes, some of the people that this book are aimed at are people who are in leadership seats. I mean, they are rocking it as the leaders of their organization. It's the types of CEOs who are gathered around my Vistage groups, and that you've certainly encountered in YPO and EO and some of these other amazing organizations around the globe. There is a lane in which, and a way in which this book is also for people who are just starting to raise their hand. And the group that I think I'm secretly most excited to talk to and incorporate is the group that is championing the leaders that we are raising up, that are championing our kids, that are championing the people that are going in and leading teams, that are on the sidelines, standing as the belief that we all borrow. and the people that we look to for confirmation and to keep our stories in check, so that on the days when the going is hard, we dig down, we reach in, and we remind ourselves that I can take a breath, I can center myself, and yeah, I really can step forward. It's going to be okay.
How was or how is what you do today, the work that you do today, informed by the fact that you went from going to college in a small town in Minnesota to studying Chinese language in China? What was that experience like, and how has it influenced the work that you do today?
I think that to answer that question, I got to tell you about how I ended up going to China in the first place, right? So I went to this fantastic liberal arts school in Minnesota, shout out to Carleton College grads. And in line in registration for my freshman year, part of what attracted me to the school was everyone studies a language, and you study until you get a certain degree of proficiency. And so I stood there and I thought, all right, I'm likely to land in a large city on the other side of these college years. So if I ever decide I want to learn Spanish, French, Italian, German, odds are I can learn those pretty easily. So how am I going to stretch? What am I going to study here that I'm probably not going to study somewhere else down the line? And for me at the time, it was Chinese or Japanese. I literally flipped a coin, registered for Chinese classes, spent the next 10 weeks beating my head against the wall because it was the hardest thing I have ever tried to learn. God bless my instructor, who kept saying to me, hang in here. There's going to be a moment when it just starts to click, but you have to, it's like that practice. You got to do the work. You got to show up. You got to trust that eventually you'll get enough context that you're going to see things that you don't see today. And it finally clicked in. And I said to her, how do I fast track this? This is great. And she said, you sign yourself up and you go study in China for a term. And so that's how I ended up in China. And because I did that, now when I come up against moments where I don't have all the answers, I don't know what it's going to look like, and I start to go into doubt of, do I really want to raise my hand? The touch point and the reference I have is raising my hand for that was one of the most exciting, challenging, yes, however, exciting, eye-opening things. So of course I'll raise my hand for this now.
Yeah. And what was like just being there, experiencing it? And did you feel like you got a comfort level then, having experienced it?
I did. So I was on a specific language study program. And so at the time that I left China, I was functionally fluent in Chinese.
Wow.
I actually considered relocating to China for a period right out of college, and for a couple of other reasons, decided not to go that direction. However, to this day, it was one of the most eye-opening, perspective-shifting periods. And I was 19, so it was the right time to be stretching my wings, looking around, and discovering differently that there's more to the world than what I had always seen or gotten comfortable thinking of first.
You have this interesting kind of career trajectory where you worked, in a coaching training capacity, and then you got recruited in by some of your prior clients to go into the corporate world and help with management and being a COO, higher level executive at a couple of different companies. And then you came back to the world of coaching and training and mentorship and stuff like that. So what was that shift like going into the corporate world after many years of coaching, which seems to be your true love?
Yeah, I never would have anticipated that I was going to be stepping in and leading a couple of companies at different points. And when the first former client of mine broached this topic and essentially said, I want to expand to another market. And so for that to happen, his belief was he needed to relocate to the new market, and he wanted to make sure that he had someone firmly in place to anchor the team and help with processes and systems and all the transition. And when he first approached me and said, I think you should do this, I laughed. I said, I only know as much about your industry as you and I have talked about in our coaching. I haven't even actually been on site at your facility. I have met no one on your team. I think that you're crazy. And I actually recommended a couple of other people that I thought he should hire instead of me. And he said, okay, we'll talk again. And he came back and he said, I really think that this is something that you can do. And here's why. And as we started unpacking it, what I discovered is it was all about moving people forward. Yes, there was a business. Yes, there were widgets. Yes, there were revenue lines and profitability and overhead and expenses and things that we were going to be paying attention to. However, at the end of the day, the biggest issue or opportunity in the mix was how do we bring his team together differently and more cohesively in an interesting timeline time frame where the leader that they were used to going to and most connected with was about to relocate to a different state. So how do we do that, and how do we figure out what is possible for this team? And as soon as we started talking about it in that lane, I went, what do I like to do most? I like to champion possibilities. I like to champion people. I like to roll up my sleeves and move things forward in an interesting, meaningful way. And, I said to him, do you care how it looks? He said, nope. Do you trust me? Yep. And to his credit, he gave me tremendous latitude. He was a tremendous champion of mine, and that team came together. I mean, we did some interesting things. I was with that team for a little less than a year and got them to a place where it felt like they didn't need me with them in the same way. And, as fate would have it, another former client had been paying attention, invited me to what I thought was a holiday lunch, and slid an employment contract offer across the table and said, what do you think? I've been watching what you did there, and we're poised for growth. What do you think about coming to play here? So I stayed a little longer with that team. And same thing. He's I call him my foxhole buddy. He's one of my, to this day, one of my closest friends and fiercest champions. He actually was the one who introduced me to Vistage, ironically. He had been a member of Vistage for about 10 years before I joined his team. And shortly when I came in the door, I think it was within my first month or so, he said, at some point, you're going to look around and realize that you need somebody at the same level who is not in this world, who you can talk to and get perspective on and help check your blind spots. And he said, I'd prefer for it not to be me, because I'd like to fish more, and that's why you're here. So when that day comes, let me know. I've got a group that would be worth checking out. And it didn't take me long to get myself to a Vistage table. And I knew pretty early on that might be an interesting place that I would want to play at some future point. And so, as the fates would have it, an opportunity opened up at the time that it was appropriate for me to be stepping out of the day-to-day where I'd been. So
I want to ask more about that, about what Vistage is for those who haven't heard of the community before, and how it serves the members of the groups. But before we do that, this is such an interesting thing to go from a coach-coachee relationship to all of a sudden the person you're coaching is now writing your checks. How do you prevent that from being a bad dynamic? How do you preserve the relationship going into that type of scenario?
Yeah, so I would say the biggest piece that was critical for us to negotiate and be clear about up front was the distinction between agreements and expectations. And to be very clear around what I was agreeing to, what he was agreeing to, what expectations or assumptions we may have in the mix, how we were defining winning, how we were going to evaluate if we were on track or off track. And fortunately, he and I had been friends and had been in this coach-coachee relationship and dynamic for about 5 or 6 years. And so we really had to talk about, we're shifting what that looks like. So are we going to be okay with the moment, and it turned out to be many moments, when we don't see eye to eye? How are we going to remind each other that we are both doing our job by talking honestly and candidly about our perspectives, our observations, our fears, all of these things? And he and I had a similar agreement to what I had with my mom, which was, we're going to have some moments where our conversation or our approach or our styles don't quite work as smoothly as they could. So how and when are we going to come back to it? How are we going to reset? How are we going to clear that off? How are we going to be vigilant about making sure that the stories we're telling about our combined possibilities are stories that move us forward, not stories that pull us apart?
That's great. All right, so let's wrap things up with more of a discussion around Vistage for those who haven't heard of it before. And it's been around for about 70 years or so. Originally from San Diego, it's a peer-to-peer group for CEOs and executives and business owners. Tell us a little bit about it.
Yeah, so Vistage has been around over 60 years. We're in 20-ish countries and over 22,000 members right now. Our home office is in San Diego today, although it actually started in the Midwest. A business owner who said, I need some perspective, and I'm not going to get it from people in my industry and certainly not in my company, nor would it be appropriate for me to ask. So he started reaching out to business owners in non-competing industries and said, what do you think about coming together once a month? Let's dive into the things that are keeping us up at night. Let's feel less lonely in this lonely, isolating role that we each find ourselves in. Let's leverage best practices. Let's figure out how we can help each other to be better and move forward as a group. And so here we are today. I have the privilege of leading 3 groups here in Las Vegas, and the average member in the group has revenues 2 million-ish all the way up to 500 plus, and anywhere from 10 employees to 1,000 employees. What's common about all of the members in my groups is they are committed to taking on their leadership. They are committed to telling the truth about, I have days when I'm great, I have days when I mess up, and the game that I choose to be in is how do I keep getting myself up, looking around, checking my blind spots, learning from people who are smarter or have different perspectives than I may think to bring first, and to keep challenging myself to finding new, different ways to not get stuck in my story. And, oh, by the way, we're also going to find ways to be more efficient. We're going to find ways to be more profitable. We're going to do all the nuts and bolts of business and growth and revenues, and we dive into all of that. However, the bigger game is, am I willing to hold up the mirror and pay close attention to how I'm leading and living my life?
That's great. Well, Tonya, this has been really interesting, really insightful. Thank you for sharing your stories here today. I want to wrap up with the question that I always ask, which is, let's pretend we're at an awards banquet, much like the Oscars or the Emmys, and you're receiving an award for lifetime achievement for everything you've done up until this point. And what we all want to know is, who do you thank, in addition to, of course, family and friends, that sort of thing, but who are the mentors, who are the peers, who are the coaches, the champions, to use your word, that you would acknowledge in your remarks?
Yeah, so my biggest champion, my truest champion for almost 20 years now, is a woman here locally by the name of Teresa Corbett. Teresa was my boss and mentor and friend back in the days when I worked at Sci Seminars, and she continues to be the belief that I borrow and the person that can put me in check faster than anybody else, and the voice I hear in my head. So she, along with my mom, my aunt, some of the other folks I've mentioned, those are the ones that have certainly shaped who I am and remind me of who I can be.
That's great. All right, and where can people learn more about you or connect with you, Tonya?
Yeah, they can visit my website, which is tonyatwitchell.com. I'm thinking you'll put it in the show notes.
Yep.
LinkedIn, they can also find me there. Those are the easiest, fastest ways to connect with me most days of the week.
All right, great. All right, thanks, Tonya.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Smart Business Revolution podcast with John Corcoran. Find out more at smartbusinessrevolution.com. And while you're there, sign up for our email list and join the revolution.
Revolution.
And be listening for the next episode of the Smart Business Revolution podcast.